Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Illinois Power Agency, I'd like to welcome you to today's information webinar for the draft REC contract related to the adjustable block program. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Again, this webinar is hosted by the Illinois Power Agency. It is to discuss the draft REC contract and to clarify the terms of the draft REC contract that has been posted to the Adjustable Block Program website. And for today's call, we are focused on explaining the mechanisms within the contract as well as to solicit your comments and input. So for today's agenda, we will walk through the contract development process, as well as the structure and how it interacts with different documents within the contract itself. We will then talk about the development and the energization requirements for the facilities, as well as the collateral requirement tied to the system and the performance assurance amounts that is looked at on an aggregate portfolio basis for the REC contract. We will then talk about invoicing and payment requirements, and we will end off the presentation portion talking about performance reviews, the annual report requirements, as well as the drawdown mechanism to ensure system performance. Before I start, I want to let you know that there is a website where you can find information about the Adjustable Block Program. The Adjustable Block Program's website is www.illinoisabp.com, ABP for the Adjustable Block Program. And there you'll find the draft REC contract as well as pertinent information for your participation in the program. So with me today are also representatives from the Illinois Power Agency. In particular, we have Brian Granahan, who is the Chief Legal Officer from the agency, as well as Kevin Quillen from Incline, the Program Administrator for the Adjustable Block Program. I'll start off this slide with a disclaimer. So any statements that you see here on this presentation or that I make on this call that describes or refer to the draft agreement that has been posted or the governing documents, they are summaries only and are qualified in their entirety by the documents. The draft agreement itself was posted on December 7th, and you, the participants, will bear the full responsibility for reviewing and understanding the written agreement. The governing documents include Public Act 990906, pursuant to which this process has been developed for the procurement of RECs through the Adjustable Block Program. The Adjustable Block Program is detailed in Chapter 6 of the IPA's Long-Term Renewable Resources Procurement Plan, which has been approved in August of this year by the Illinois Commerce Commission in docket number 170838. You'll find some of these documents and the law online, and certainly the draft contracts online on the APB website. In terms of the contract development process, I'll start here by laying out kind of the key timeline that has occurred thus far in the development of this contract. The contract itself has been developed in consultation with the utilities, which will be the counterparties to this contract with you, the approved vendors. The utilities are Ameren Illinois Company, Commonwealth Edison Company, and Mid-American Energy Company. We have also developed this contract in consultation with the staff of the Illinois Commerce Commission, as well as the IPA and the Program Administrator. My name is Benjamin Shi. I am with NERA. NERA is the Procurement Administrator for the IPA for its competitive procurements. and I'm here to assist in development of the draft contracts and the contract itself to be used for the adjustable block program. We have posted the draft contracts online on December 7 with an invitation for you to comment on the draft document. We have received comments from 9 parties on December 19 when the deadline was due, and we have since posted these comments online on the program website. Based on the comments that we have received, which are invaluable to us, we have then gone out with an announcement for a webcast, which is what today's webcast is about, to explain some of the key terms of the contract, as well as open up the draft contract for a second round of comments. The second round of comments are due to us by December 31st, close of business, and we will then take the time to review the contract comments and make necessary adjustments. The expected date for the contract to be finalized and released is January 11, in time for the program launch on January 15. So again, we really want to hear from you. We have received very good comments that we are considering, and at this time, we ask that you submit your comments to us after this call based on information that you have seen online, as well as information that you hear on this call, and to get your comments to us by 5 p.m. on December 31st. The contract itself is available, and the website address is here on the top of this screen on slide 5, illinoisabp.com. And if you look at the top navigation bar, there is a link called Resources. If you click on that, scroll down, you'll find a sublink in the top navigation that says REC Contract. There you will find the invitation to comment on the draft REC contract as posted on December 7, together with the December 7 version of the draft REC contract. Importantly, you will also find in the third link on that page the comments that we have received from all 9 parties. These comments were posted online, but the commenter, the identifying information has been redacted. So the comments that we have received are useful to us. They are being evaluated at this time, and we are making the necessary adjustments after we have reviewed these comments, and we have also afford a chance for a second round of comments to be received and reviewed. For this second round, you're going to be reviewing the same draft REC contract as posted on December 7. There is no second draft, and the process is exactly the same as the first round. You go to the website, you can download the materials there. The draft REC contract is there, as well as the invitation to comment. The only thing that is different is the deadline. We ask that you submit your comments to us by email to the email address that is provided, comments@illinoisabp.com. Your comments must be clearly indicated with track changes in redline in Microsoft Word. That will help us understand concretely what you're after and what you're asking us to consider as changes. If you give us something in abstract, we will not be able to do much with that. We'll try our best, but the best way to communicate the changes that you're seeing that are necessary is to provide that to us in a redline track change document in Microsoft Word. We also ask that you provide us explanatory notes to the extent that you think they may not be self-explanatory, either in a separate document or highlighted in track changes in the redline draft document. And once we are in receipt of your comments, they will be redacted and then posted online. And the redaction of the identity of the commenter is important to our process because it helps us focus on the content of the comments rather than the commenter who is actually making those comments. And so you know, these redacted versions of the comments are also the versions that are being passed along to the reviewers for consideration. The IPA, the program administrator, and NERAS, the procurement administrator, will review these together with Ameren Illinois, ComEd, Mid-American Energy, as well as the staff of the ICC. So the parties that review this will be using the redacted version of the comments as the basis for considering the comments. This process is actually described and laid out in the IPA Long-Term Renewable Resources Procurement Plan, and it mirrors the process that is used in the IPA competitive procurements as required under sections of the Public Utilities Act. So with those housekeeping items, I will also mention one other item, which is that you may, through this Zoom platform that you have signed on to look at this presentation, you may ask your questions using the chat function. We will try to address some of the questions along the way if we can, but we'll certainly allocate time at the end of the presentation portion to address your specific questions. We may not get to all of them, but we will prioritize questions that seems to be posing a confusion to the reviewers, and then talk about some of the rationale to the extent possible. We have also received some questions in advance yesterday via email. We will also try to address them as we go along during this presentation to the extent applicable and practicable. So first, we will move to talk about the basics of the adjustable block program and how it interacts with the contract execution and administration process. So here I lay out some key milestones that will sort of give you a roadmap to how to think about the steps in stages as you participate in this adjustable block program. So on this roadmap that you see here on slide 8, the first thing that you must do is to be qualified as an approved vendor under the adjustable block program and to apply for an award under the adjustable block program. Through that program, you will propose systems and you will be asked to group your systems into batches. Once it has been reviewed by the program administrator, has been vetted through the program requirements, it will then be sent up to the Illinois Commerce Commission for approval. The batch of systems, and you can propose multiple batches of system or systems, will then be submitted and subject to the approval of the ICC. Once it has been approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission, the REC contract must be fully executed by both buyer and seller within 7 days, and the collateral that is due under the REC contract is due within 30 business days from the ICC approval date. At that point, and I'll use a couple of these terms up front, just keep note of them as I provide this roadmap to you, because we'll circle back to some of these terms again. At the time of the ICC approval, you will be asked to execute something called a product order. A product order is tied to an approved batch. A product order is going to be appended to the REC contract, and it will detail some of the transaction details as agreed at the trade date, which is the ICC approval date. With each product order again is tied to a batch, you will have two schedules, a Schedule A and a Schedule B to the product order. Schedule A will be required one for each system in that batch. So you have a product order that is tied to a batch, and you have a Schedule A, one for each system in that batch. At that point, Schedule A will be filled in with proposed system information. And that is the extent of the requirements once the ICC has approved a batch. After that point, the contract will allow you two phases for each facility, and I'll get to that more concretely. But there is going to be a development phase where you will build your system as you have proposed under the ABP. And once the system is built, installed, and is operational, it is energized, it has to be registered with GATS or MRATs, and a standing order that will provide for the automatic transfer of those racks during the delivery term must be established. And that is one trigger to say that the process for energization is complete. And at that point, Schedule B to the product order for that system will be completed and will be appended to the rack contract as part of the system-specific information. So the contract can have many Schedule Bs, one for each system. And one thing to note up front here is that while Schedule A is executed all at the same time on the ICC approval date, Schedule B is completed on a rolling basis as systems starts to get energized. You will see Schedule B being completed along the way. Once it is energized and a standing order has been established in GATS or MRATs for a particular system, that is the trigger for payments authorization. So we can only authorize payment to the approved vendor when the system is energized. And you can have many systems, and the payment structure is going to be different for each system. And the next milestone here at a high level is for you to get paid. You get paid upfront once the system is energized. Upfront meaning either in a single payment if your system is small, or over 17 quarterly periods if your system is large. But you're not going to be waiting 15 years to get paid. You'll be getting paid either once upfront or within the first 4 years of the delivery term. And after energization, to help with payments and how much you can invoice the utilities, we're going to prepare for you what we call a quarterly netting statement. Just take note of this term, quarterly netting statement. This is a defined term that will provide payment amounts that cumulatively cannot be exceeded at a point in time. At the point when the quarterly netting statement is issued, it will indicate the maximum amount that is authorized to be paid at the upcoming quarter. And buyer, which is the utility that is the counterparty to your REC contract, will simply look at this maximum amount to make sure that the amounts that have been paid previously up to that point in time, including the pending payment, will never exceed this maximum amount indicated in the quarterly netting statement. Once you are getting paid, the next key milestone under the contract is for you to keep providing your REC annual reports. This is required from you every year for the remaining 15 years of the delivery term. This will be the basis for how we will track performance and evaluate the performance of your systems. If your system is underperforming based on the expected rec quantities that we believe the system is to produce over the 15-year term for which payments have been made, then drawdowns of your collateral may occur. And I'll get to all of these points in more detail throughout the presentation, but here sort of gives you a framework to think about the key steps in stages as we move on to the rec contract discussions here. I will, in the next 2 slides, discuss some of the key levels of information to help you fix some ideas and to think about the rec contract as well as timing elements. So here, the first thing to note is that the contract itself is going to be between you and a applicable utility. Ameren Illinois, ComEd, or MEC, the IPA, and the program administrator, they are not counterparties. It's between you and the utility. And the next thing to note is the rec contract will be signed only once under this initial procurement plan. Is going to be signed by you once with a utility. It could be with multiple utilities, but at most one with a utility. And when you have the first batch approved by the ICC, you will have to sign both the rec contract itself as well as the product order or product orders that will come under a single rec contract with the utility. So the rec contract is at the approved vendor level. This is also what we commonly call the portfolio level. When you hear the word portfolio, this is referring to the contract level. Then we have a batch level. I sort of touched on this on the prior slide. For each approved batch by the ICC, you will sign what we call a product order. And a product order is also known as the level of a transaction. The product order will have something called a trade date. The trade date on the product order is the date of the ICC approval. So I mentioned the product order up front here because you could have multiple product orders that are signed concurrently if the batch or batches are approved by the ICC on the same date. For subsequent blocks that you are awarded in the future under this plan, if you have been awarded a subsequent batch at a later point in time, it will give rise to a product order that then needs to be executed at that time, and the trade date will reflect the date of the subsequent ICC approval. So that is at the batch level or the transaction level. When you think about product order, think of an approved batch. And then we have a more granular level in which most of the activities will take place under in terms of the evaluation of system performance. And with at the system level, what we call designated system under the contract, the information that is most pertinent under the contract, you'll find with the details of each designated system are the schedules appended to the product order. We have Schedule A that contains preliminary information that has been proposed by you under the APB for projects that have not been energized. Once your systems have been energized, you will complete, as I said, a Schedule B to the product order that will contain final contract terms tied to the system. Schedule B will determine the payment terms and the delivery obligations for the particular system upon energization. In terms of time elements, just to keep things straight for you, I'll mention some of the more critical elements up front so that you can keep track of them as you review the contract. The first is besides the term of the agreement and that spans throughout the 15 years and a little bit more, depending on the systems that you have that come on and roll off, we have a review process that evaluates the performance of your systems on an annual basis. And when we say an annual basis, it's not a calendar year, but a delivery year. A delivery year runs from June 1st to May 31st of the following year. So that is how we define a delivery year. Your REC annual reports are due after each delivery year that looks back at the performance in the immediately preceding year that has just concluded. So a delivery year again runs from June through May, and the system performance and drawdowns occurs once a year after the end of the delivery year. We will cover that as we talk about drawdowns and reporting requirements later on. There is a term known as delivery term. You need to understand what this means. A delivery term commences in the month after the first REC delivery has been received by the utility, and it ends 15 years thereafter. All your RECs that are generated during the delivery term, starting from when you set up your standing order and when your first REC has been received pursuant to that standing order through the end of the delivery term, belong to the utility. And then you have these quarterly periods that are referenced in the contract. Quarterly periods are there sort of to give you a framework to know when certain key dates are due throughout the delivery year. And this is crucial only really in the front part of the contract. And I say front part because it deals most critically with when invoices are due and payments are due. In the later 10 years of the delivery term, there's really not much to do that. Most things are handled on a delivery year basis. But for the front end of the term of the contract, the quarters are quite important. And the quarters follow the delivery year framework, which runs from June through May, and then you divide it into 4 pieces. So a first quarter would be from June through August, second quarter running from September to November, the third quarter running December through February, and the last quarter to end off a delivery year from March through May. Again, invoicing and payments occurs on a quarterly basis. Also of note, there will be some payment adjustments related to community solar projects. And if you have a community solar project, just take note that for the first year of your operation, you'll be required to provide these quarterly reports, which I will go over, that will adjust your payments. That will sync up with the quarters and quarterly periods that I have just mentioned here. So just a recap again very quickly and to fix some ideas. The REC contract is between you, the approved vendor, as the seller, and the utility as the buyer. You may submit multiple batches through the program. A batch must be for a minimum kW capacity, and generally that is 100 kW. If you're a small business or a certain type of business, you may be allowed to submit a batch of a little less than 100 kW. This is discussed in the procurement plan as well as through the information that is provided as requirements under the ABP. And a batch, importantly, may be for one system or also could be for multiple systems. The batches are subject to ICC approval. Once the batch is approved, the program administrator will assign the batch to a utility. You, as the seller or approved vendor, you do not or get to choose which utility to sign the contract with. You must be willing to sign the contract with one or all of the utilities at this time. The contracts the contract terms are harmonized. They're the same terms that will be used by all three utilities. And importantly, your batch will not be split across multiple utilities. The batch will stay intact, your systems will stay intact. It's just who it will be assigned to, and you could have 2 or 3 batches that have been approved, and they could all reside with one utility, or it could be with multiple utilities, meaning one batch going to, for example, Ameren, Illinois, another batch going to ComEd, and the third batch going with Mid-American Energy. And at this time, it is envisaged that subsequent batches that are approved under this initial long-term plan will be simply an additional transaction under this REC contract, and a new product order will be all that is required. You will not be required to sign a new REC contract if it is an award pursuant to this initial long-term renewable resources procurement plan. In terms of a couple of tips for you how to review the REC contract, my strong recommendation is start with the definitions first, because there are these defined terms that are used throughout the REC contract. You will see them used if you don't understand whether they are at a contract level, meaning a portfolio level, or a batch level, or a transaction level, or a system level. You'll get lost in the review process trying to figure out what exactly the mechanism is meant to do. So I have laid out here a couple of defined terms. You'll find them in the cover sheet in section 13B or in the Master REC Agreement in Article 1. I will cover the structure on the next slide. But here are some of the defined terms that lays out for you the fact that you have 3 levels conceptually that you're dealing with: the portfolio level, a batch level, and a system level. And there are these defined terms that correspond and are tied to these different levels that you need to be cognizant of. So the REC contract itself contains one cover sheet. That's the front part or the main body of the REC contract. And it contains 8 exhibits, exhibit A through H. The key exhibits for you to know is exhibit A, which is the form of the product order, and exhibit H, the ABA EMA ACOS standard REC purchase and sale agreement that we are incorporating to govern the agreement terms, which we are also calling the Master REC Agreement. So just take note, there is a cover sheet that lays out the main provisions of your obligations, which is governed otherwise by Exhibit H, and there is a product A that will be quite important for product and transaction details. Besides that, we have a couple of templates, forms, reports, and examples that you can refer to, and they are found in Exhibit B through G. So importantly, many of you have asked the questions: how does the REC contract work? Is it at the batch level, at a portfolio level, at a system level? And why is there a Exhibit H? How does it interact? So I'm going to explain it to you here on this slide 14. So the cover sheet itself is the front part of the agreement. It is the main body, and it contains specific terms relevant to the adjustable block program, including facility requirements, delivery obligation and payment and invoicing terms, as well as penalties for under performance or non-performance. The main body of the cover sheet will modify the Master REC Agreement, which is Exhibit H, the industry standard REC Master Purchase and Sale Agreement. It will modify it in at least 2 ways that I'll highlight for you at a very high level. First, it introduces new definitions And second, it replaces the existing definitions found in the Master Rec Agreement. It also replaces existing provisions that are found in the Master Rec Agreement, or it will indicate whether provisions found in the Master Rec Agreements will be applicable or not. So just take note that Exhibit H, you can think of it as the agreement that governs unless it is modified by the cover sheet. And certainly the cover sheet modifies several of the provisions in Exhibit H. I'll talk about the product order here. The product order, as I have said, is at the batch level, and it contains Schedule A and Schedule B. One rec contract can have multiple product order or product orders. I should say one for each batch that has been approved. And if your batch contains multiple systems, then there will be multiple Schedule A's and multiple Schedule B's appended to that product order. Schedule A and Schedule B are at the system level, completed upon ICC approval, and it will detail the proposed pricing and facility information related to the system. After you have built the system, registered that with GATS or MRETS, have a standing order in place, then we will proceed to complete Schedule B and append that to your product order. The Schedule B will be completed upon energization, and it will be the document that provides the final pricing and payment information that is relevant to the system. In terms of energization of your project and the development obligations, I will talk about this rec contract at a system level first. So a few things to note. At a system level, once you have an ICC approval, the trade date is entered into the product order, a Schedule A is being completed, and you will have 12 months to build the system, unless it is a community solar project for which you'll be allowed 18 months. Once it has been developed and a standing order is in place with GATS or MRETS for the automatic transfer of your RECSTROM system, then you will have about 15 years for the delivery of your RECs. At that point, when your standing order is established, we will provide you Schedule B. So in essence, the contract envisage and contemplates two phases, the development phase and the delivery phase. And all RECs generated during the delivery term will belong to the utility counterparty. In terms of energization, all systems under the ABP must be new systems. The date of final interconnection approval cannot be earlier than June 1st, 2017. There will be the scheduled energized date that will be fixed in Schedule A, and there will be some allowance for extensions. You can review them in Section 5B of the cover sheet. And with each extension that has been granted to you, we will then update Schedule A accordingly. There are fee-based extensions, and then there are non-fee-based extensions. Some extension fees that are paid are refunded, and others are not. So take a look at Section B for the details that are there. And as I said, the contract contemplates delivery as well as development, and we are trying to mitigate both risks related to development as well as delivery through the collateral requirements under the contract. So here, if there is a system that is proposed and awarded a block under the contract but is not brought to fruition, never gets energized by the deadline, then the system is removed from the REC contract and the collateral requirement associated with that system will be forfeited. Once a system is energized, and it is energized by the scheduled energized date as may be amended or extended, then payment is authorized. Energization is a defined term under the REC contract. Just take note of that. And the main thing to note is that for energization to occur, standing order must be established with GATS or MRATs. The standing order will provide for the automatic recurring transfer of the RECs from the system throughout the delivery term. And if you are a community solar project, energization would also mean that at least 50% of the actual nameplate capacity has been subscribed. If 50% is not reached, then the project is not energized. That's just how energization is defined for purposes of the REC contract and for purposes to authorize payment. So there's a question related to the size of the system. What happens if the final size when you build a system is different from the proposed size as approved in your batch by the ICC as you apply and propose that through the adjustable block program? So we covered a few scenarios here. First, at the system level, I will make it very clear. Payments is based on two elements. One is a price, and the second is a quantity. And it's just simple, just like any payment terms that you'll find. So the question is, how are you defining price and how you're defining quantity? So the first half of the slide on the top here on slide 20, I'll cover what happens if your proposed size is of a certain kW and it becomes a larger kW. As you can find here on the top part of this slide 20, it went from 4 panels to 5 panels and has increased its size. So if it has increased its size, then the contract price will be the price applicable to the final larger size that is prevailing at the point of energization. So again, the contract price will be based on the larger system size as prevailing under the adjustable block program at the time of energization of this system. And the quantity will be based on the proposed size, the smaller size. So the quantity and the price will generally be the lower of the price that you will receive between the proposed and the final, and the quantity will generally be based on the smaller of the proposed size or the final size. So if you work that through to the bottom half of this slide dealing with the opposite scenario, where you have a system that is proposed, and when you build it, it is actually smaller than what is proposed, then the contract price that you'll be ultimately paid at will be the proposed price, which is the lower price. And the quantity will be based on the final size, which is the smaller of the proposed and the final. So again, the rationale behind this is really to mitigate IPA's budgeting constraints and issues. We have a plan, we have a budget, we have allocated money for this award, and we just want to make sure that it doesn't pose issues downstream when you propose for a system of a particular size and you build and it becomes something that is vastly different. Allowable variance for size will be the greater of 5% of the proposed size or 1 kilowatt, whichever is greater. So this is what we are proposing at this time as the draft contract stands. We have received some comments from commenters to increase this. We are taking this under consideration. If you have comments on this particular point, we welcome them. We ask that you submit your inputs to us. If you are against some of the comments that you've seen, we ask that you make that known to us as well. We're looking to calibrate this size issue appropriately. For community solar, there is a second layer of price adjustments that will take place at the community solar project system level. Again, for payment, it is simply the contract price and quantity, and it will change or be adjusted based on two factors. If the community solar subscription mix, meaning the percent of the nameplate capacity, the contract nameplate capacity that is being subscribed by small subscriber, if it increases, then the contract price will increase as well for the first year of operation. For the quantity, it will be adjusted based on the subscriber rate. As the actual nameplate capacity is being subscribed and the percentage increases, then you can think of it as there are more rack quantities being considered, and therefore the payment will increase accordingly. So for community solar, the price and the quantity elements will be adjusted quarterly during the first year of operations, after which on the last information received for the last quarter, we will fix that as the final basis for payment terms for your system. And just take note, this is, I'm describing all these payment terms and quantity elements only because we have to link it back to the fact that we are making payments upfront. We have to decide upfront the quantity that is expected from the system at the front end of the contract, when your system may or may not have even produced a single rack, and we're not paying you along the way when we receive the racks. We're paying you based on an expectation that these quantities will come and be delivered along the way. So that's one way to see the community solar. One aspect of the plan provides for the removal of systems and the reapplication of revised systems through the ABP. So this is provided in the situations where, for example, you have built the system and you do not like the price because the size has changed, the payment terms have changed, and you would like the systems to be re-evaluated with the correct pricing. For example, if you have proposed a small system, but you have expanded the systems, you're not being paid for the extra quantity of racks, and you would like that to be accounted for. So you can pull the system out of the rack contract and resubmit an application for that system. And so by doing so, you will have to go through the process of the adjustable block program again, provide a new application fee, and be subject to the then prevailing price under the adjustable block program. You can do that also if you want to change from a distributed generation project to a community solar project and vice versa. If your system size is within the allowable range, you can do that by a request to buyer and the IPA and the program administrator. If the system size is outside of the allowable variance, then your system is automatically removed from the rack contract. You can always resubmit a revised application if you want to, but that is entirely up to you. But at this point, if it is outside of the variance that I just described, then it will be automatically removed. In either case, when we remove the racks or the system from the rack contract, we will also remove the collateral requirement from that associated with that system, and you will forfeit that collateral requirement. But that requirement will be reinstated or reapplied to your REC contract if your resubmitted application is successfully approved by the ICC within 365 days of the time when your REC system has been removed from the contract. So that's how we are providing the requirements under the REC contract at this time. I'll talk very quickly about the collateral requirement here, and then I'll talk about other aspects of delivery after, because we have talked quite a bit of the collateral requirement at this point, and it is kind of crucial for you to understand what the requirements are. So in terms of the requirement, it's simply 5% that is required of you of the contract value at this time. If your project is not energized, it will be 5%, multiply that by the proposed price, multiply that by the RECs based on the proposed size. Once it is energized, the collateral requirement is 5% of the contract price, whatever that is being determined as the final contract price, times the quantity based on the final contract size that we determine to be the contract size, not the actual nameplate capacity, but the RECs that are determined for payment. And then that is all at a system level. We will aggregate all of the collateral requirement across your systems, across product orders, to get to the portfolio level. And that is what we call the seller's performance assurance, simply the sum of the collateral requirement across the designated system. And that is due, the first time that you have to provide this amount is due within 30 business days of the trade date of when the ICC approved the batch of systems or the batches of systems that you have provided under the ABP. And for the return of your collateral, once it is in place with the utility, they will return it back to you after all systems in a batch has rolled off. So that's how it currently stands. We have received quite a number of comments related to this issue, collateral requirement. We're taking all of those into consideration. If you have views on the collateral requirement, how it's administered, how it's handled, we ask that you provide us feedback because we want to hear before making any adjustments on the provisions as laid out in the draft contract. I'll talk about payment and invoicing. Just a quick note, payment and invoicing is separate from the collateral requirement. Collateral requirement is there to mitigate development risk as well as delivery risk. So if your system is built or is proposed but never gets built, that's a development risk for which the collateral requirement will be taken care of. We will take the collateral requirement if it doesn't get built. The same with delivery risk under the contract. If it is proposed to perform in a certain way and it doesn't produce any RECs throughout the term of the delivery or produces at a very subpar level, then there are penalties involved, and that's where the collateral requirement will kick in. And we'll talk about the drawdowns later on. But I'll talk about payment and invoicing here first, because payment and invoicing is a separate concept. It occurs upfront of the contract once the system is built. Once the system is in place, it has registered with GATS and MRATs, and a standing order is in place, you will either be paid one single 100% payment upfront if your system is small, below 10 kW. Or if your system is large, larger than 10 kW, or it's a community solar project, then you receive one payment upfront for 20% of the value, and the remaining balance is paid over 16 quarterly periods thereafter. The main thing that I have said earlier is that payment is going to be on a quarterly basis, here on this slide 27 is where I'm going to note for you a few things that are critical for you to understand. So payment due dates, 4 times in a delivery year. Please take note of them. If you do not get your invoices to buyer in time, then you wait an extra quarter before you submit your next invoice, and you can roll it up into that subsequent invoice. So if you want to get paid on time, please submit your invoice by these dates, by the 10th of June, September, December, or March. Once they are received by the buyer on a timely basis, by the 10th of these quarterly periods, buyer will pay you either 100% for your system or 20% for your system, and the remaining on these quarterly periods. But they will pay you at the end of the month when the invoices are received. They don't entertain late payments, but they will pay you on a timely basis. If you are a new vendor, there is an allowance for buyer that they may need an extra month to enter you into their systems before payments can be effected. So that's the only thing that buyer is asking. They are committed to timely payments, but they will also be allowed to have an extra month if you're a new vendor and there is an onboarding process in their system to get you on. So to make things simple for both buyer and seller, the administrator, the APB program administrator, will issue to both buyer and seller a quarterly netting statement prior to the invoice due date. You must take the netting statement and attach that to your invoice for payment. So that is what will be a critical item that buyer will look at in order to effect and initiate and process payment. The quarterly netting statement will indicate or reflect a maximum payment amount that cumulatively cannot be exceeded under the REC contract. So if you provide a netting statement with your invoice, buyer will look at how much payment has occurred so far under the REC contract, and they will look at the maximum that is provided in the quarterly netting statement, and to make sure that any additional payments that are being made pursuant to that timely invoice will not exceed that maximum amount that has been authorized up to that point in time. Take a look at section 2.2 of the Master REC Agreement as modified by the cover sheet for the details on payment terms. In terms of performance, performance review and evaluating the performance of your system, and to exact any penalties for underperformance, we have a very detailed example provided in Exhibit G for a drawdown example. So I encourage you to review that. The details are there. All I'm going to do on this slide is to go through a very high level the main concept so that you have an idea of how this is done at the end of a delivery year. So drawdowns and reviews are done in aggregate by looking across all systems on a portfolio basis. But the way that we start is by looking on a system by system level to determine whether a system is outperforming or underperforming. So I'll talk about this on the next slide, how to evaluate whether a system is outperforming or underperforming, and a matrix that we're using. It's not just based on an expectation. and how much you have delivered in a particular year, but it is based on some averaging, and I'll talk about that, and based on some assumed capacity factor, and I'll discuss that as well on the next slide. But here at the high level, the first step is for us to evaluate whether a system is underperforming and therefore has a shortfall amount, or is outperforming and has a surplus RECs in excess of the expectation in a particular delivery year that has just concluded. For outperforming systems, the RECs that are considered in excess of the expected delivery quantity for that particular delivery year are all considered as surplus RECs. Surplus RECs are then deposited into a surplus REC account. This is just a virtual account that is tracked in the books. It's never found in a sub-account, for example, within GETS or NRETS. This is recorded by the program administrator and the buyer and the IPA on paper behind the scenes to know how much excess you have. So this is a surplus REC account. Surplus REC accounts are on a portfolio basis. Once RECs are deposited there in this account, they don't keep track of where the RECs came from, which system the surplus RECs came from. They all mean the same thing. And the surplus RECs have no value in price. They just put in an account that will never expire. They are there for use in case you have a shortfall in another system, and then that is where it gets applied. So at a portfolio level, RECs from surplus REC account is used to cover underperforming systems that have shortfall amounts in that particular delivery year for which we are evaluating performance. And we will apply these surplus RECs to these underperforming systems with the lowest contract price first. And we'll keep going and applying these surplus RECs until we have no more surplus RECs in the surplus REC account. Then we will start to require collateral drawdowns. The collateral drawdowns will simply commensurate with the contract price of the system that is having a shortfall amount that is remaining and the contract price of that system. So a few things to keep in mind up front is, under the law, all of your RECs during the delivery term belongs to buyer. We are not very precise on matching exact deliveries to exact payments. The concepts of surplus and shortfalls is just a way for us to account for performance against the contracted expected quantities for which payments are being made upfront. So that's all that we're trying to do here. We have received a lot of comments on that. We're taking them into consideration. We ask for your input in this second round. If you have a view on how this should be administered, we ask that you let us know. On one level of detail, one level more detail than what I just covered on a very high level, is the matrix used for evaluating system performance on a system level. So there are two sides of the equation. One is the expected REC quantity that we are expecting you to provide or deliver for that delivery year. That's on the left side of slide 30. And on the right is the measure of actual REC performance for the system for that delivery year. So I'll cover the left first. So the delivery expected REC quantity is known when your system is energized. We know the exact system size at that point in time. We know the contracted nameplate capacity that we are using for purposes of payment. And with that, the delivery schedule for the entire 15 years is laid out in Schedule B. And based on the size of the system, the capacity factor that is fixed, and a 0.5% degradation factor, we provide the expected REC quantity to be measured against your delivery performance each year for 15 years, and we provide that in Schedule B. We take that number and we make the calculation for each delivery year, and we round it down by 1 REC. We do that because that is the measure in which your performance must be matched up against. And we're trying here in both sides on the expectation and on the performance to include mechanisms to mitigate drawdowns. And that's why we round down the number of RECs that are expected for each delivery year. We received a comment on that, and with an understanding that the commenter is wondering why we round down, and we round down to mitigate an occurrence of drawdown. That's precisely why we round down the numbers each year. And on the right side, similarly, we use a 3-year rolling average of actual deliveries from the system rather than what is the actual deliveries in that particular delivery year as a measure of system performance. That's on the right side. To the extent that the 3-year rolling average cannot be calculated as a strict 3-year rolling average because 3 delivery years of operations has not occurred in the beginning of the delivery term, then we simply use an annualized average of the actual deliveries that has occurred thus far. So for the first year, we use 1 year worth of REC quantities. For the second year, we use 2 years worth of REC quantities to come up with the performance measure, to measure against and to compare against the expected REC quantities. There are a couple of questions regarding why don't you use a 3-year rolling average and keep to that. And if a system has not achieved 3 full years of operations, then maybe you do not make that evaluation. And here the rationale for why we use 1 year and 2 years worth of averaging at the front end of the delivery term is because if you don't have 3 full years to determine whether there is a shortfall, we can also not use any of the RECs that are outperforming if they are in surplus to cover any shortfall for other systems. And this again is with the rationale to mitigate any drawdowns. So, I understand that there are some commenters that have asked us to stick to just 3 years of rolling average and not to make any evaluation for shortfalls in the early years. But on the flip side of the coin, we did that so that if there are any surplus, you can use those surplus in the early part of the contract term in year 1 and 2 of the system to apply that elsewhere. And so just want you to consider the merits of why we are doing what we are doing. And again, the left side and the right side of this is really just for us to measure system performance and also with the understanding that to the best that we can, we will want to mitigate any drawdown occurrence. On assignments, you may assign the REC contract once it is been executed. A few things to note for you at this time is not that we are not going to change this. We're looking for your input on this particular aspect of assignments. We have received some comments thus far, but we don't have specific red lines that we're trying to work with. So if you have specific information and you'd like us to consider, please let us know how this can be done. The contract itself is on a portfolio basis, so we are, as the contract is being drafted, assignments are for the entire contract only. Requests may be made, but made no earlier than 30 days after the trade date so that at least the information on the contract can be brought into the utility system and not be transferred or assigned straight away without a chance for us to even have the dust settle on the settlement of this contract first. There will be no automatic assignments. The request must identify the transferee or assignee, and you must provide all pertinent information and documentation as you make that request. The transferee must be an approved vendor under the adjustable book program. So these are the items that are standing with the draft agreement. We ask that you provide us your comments and inputs if you have a different position on this that will help us understand why. On reports, a couple of things very quickly. There are only 3 reports that are required under the adjustable block program contract, but these are recurring in nature. Before a system is energized, again, you will have up to 12 months to energize a project, or 18 months if you're a community solar project. We ask that you submit to us for all your pre-energized projects a biannual system status report every 6 months. 6 months from trade date and 6 months thereafter, just to let us know the status of your system development. We have also something called the Community Solar Quarterly Report. This is done for community solar projects after the system is energized. For the first year of operation, the plan provides for quarterly adjustments and true-ups to adjust the price as well as the quantity of community solar projects. This report is due with each quarter. Remember, I talked about the quarterly periods up front. This is due with the invoicing due dates for the first year of operations. And then finally, and importantly, you'll be providing these REC annual reports to buyer and the IPA and the program administrator at least 15 times at the conclusion of each delivery year. So a delivery year runs from June through May. By July 10, succeeding the end of the delivery year, you will report on the performance of the delivery that just concluded. We have afforded a 90-day window for the review, clarification, and cures of any deficiency related to information found in the REC annual report. A few of you have questioned about the 90-day deficiency cure period. This is it, 90 days from July 10 is what we have provided, and then we will have to close out on the delivery year with an assessment of drawdowns or an assessment of whether the portfolio remains intact as outperforming. So all that review has to be closed out by the end of the year, and the 90-day window is integrated into that process at that time. Importantly, the REC annual report is the report for which we will base our performance review of your systems under your portfolio to make any calls on drawdowns and system adjustments. And importantly, I want to let you know that the reports, the 3 reports here, almost all of them are to be completed online. They'll be automated, and you use that to submit your reports. And more information regarding that will come from the program administrator. So with that, I will stop to take questions. I will put up the slide again, but I want to at least provide a chance for all of you who are on the line to ask your questions. At this time, the presentation as well as the recording will be posted on the Adjustable Block Programs website as well after this call. But at this time, please submit your questions. We may not be able to get through all of them. We'll get through as many as we possibly and practicably can, and we'll go from there.
Ben, this is Brian. There are a number of questions that have already been submitted, I know. And then there were those that were submitted in advance as well. I'm not sure how you want to handle things, but we do have quite a bit that we can work from. Ben, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Brian. We will start with some of the questions that we have received in advance, and then we will move on to those that newly asked right now. A lot of the questions I have covered during the presentation as best as I could, and so I will not be going over them on this call again at this Q&A session. But,
Ben, what's your availability beyond 12:30 also, because Central, because it's 12:21 now?
Yeah, I will be available for the next 40 minutes or so. So to the extent that folks are available on this call, we'll see how many questions we can cover and have a plan for soliciting comments through the second round of comments period to the extent that they are valid and they are not clarifying in nature. But we'll try to address clarifying questions as best as we can, I think, first. In the next half hour or so. Anything else to add, Brian?
Well, I think there's a few areas, thinking through comments on Monday, where we'd specifically like feedback on, because we're considering changes and we'd just like some additional information, if it's available, from the market as to how to get a solution right. One thing is the right system size change range. We had 5% in the draft contract that received a fair amount of pushback. So the question then would be, what's the right percentage? And what have we seen in other jurisdictions that we think may be appropriate to use here? Another may be, how do we handle assignment when assignment is required to be to an approved vendor? We know there are circumstances where potentially there could be a default and a bank takes over the receipt of payments under a contract, and that bank isn't likely to be an approved vendor. There might be circumstances that we have to handle through the contract for situations like that on assignment that we'd like good feedback on, keeping in mind that the policy rationale behind having the assignee be an approved vendor. Again, on the 3-year rolling average, we can see arguments both ways, as I think Ben highlighted. So we'd like feedback taking into account the fact that you wouldn't be able to use overperformance in the first couple of years if we weren't allowing those for a calculation based upon the first year or two. Is that still something that the industry wants? And then also reviewing other stakeholders' comments. If there are items there that you think you can build on some of the comments that have been offered, certainly take those into account in any written comments that you provide next week. Those are the areas that I'd identified, at least, for additional feedback through the comment process.
Thank you. Brian, I'll just cover some of the clarifying questions we have here, and then we'll move on to where we find them, additional questions that have been asked at this time. So for one, there is a question on subscriber levels and subscription mix and how it will be calculated. For one, there are some high-level information that have been covered on the slide, but for the details, I think what we will do is that we will try to provide them either as an exhibit to the REC contract or a separate document that provides for that calculation. So that's what we will be forthcoming in terms of the calculations for subscriber mix, as well as the calculation for subscriber rates and a true-up, given that things may not be static at a point in time and may be more fluid. On assignments, I think Brian has covered that. I'm not going to add more to what he has said, but it's an area where I have seen several commenters comment on, and I do ask that you provide your feedback to us. If you have a strong view on how assignments should work, we do ask that you provide us your comments and track changes. There is a question on whether if there are modifications that are requested from banks related to the letters of credit. We don't have a process for that at this point, but we're taking that into consideration. And then there are questions related to payment recapture or drawdowns and settlement amounts and termination payments. A few quick things here at a very high level I want to note is that as you read through the contract, it is not envisaged or contemplated by us or intended by us to have cross default across systems. So if one system is not performing out of 100 systems that you have under the REC contract, the intent is not for that one system to cause a default of the contract that would jeopardize the remaining 99 systems. That is not our intent. So as I have laid out, there are many things that are done on a portfolio basis at the batch level and at the system level. Most of the drawdowns and penalties, if it is related to a system issue, then it will be dealt with at that level. There are some things that we do aggregate for purposes of administration, such as how we handle performance assurance. It is done on a portfolio basis, how we will allocate surplus RECs across shortfall amounts, that is done on a portfolio basis. But it is not, an event of default is very, very seldom or not contemplated to be tied to a particular system. And there are questions related to cure periods that I have addressed on this call at this time, so I'm not going to go through them further. It's limited to the deficiencies found in the annual report. That's what is envisaged and contemplated under the plan, to be clear. There are questions related to a capacity factor changes and use of a different degradation factor when calculating the amount of RECs. I just want to take note, there are a couple of things we can do, some things our hands are tied. So the entire contract is based on the plan that is proposed by the IPA as approved by the ICC. The 0.5% degradation factor is in the plan. We're just applying it and reflecting it in the contract. The few things that we are allowed to make are things like the a request to use a special capacity factor, but we don't have the ability to make changes to the 0.5% degradation factor. So you may get to the same place, but using a different mechanism. But all that is, some things are being considered, but just wanted to make clear that within the mechanisms that are afforded, some things are fixed in the plan at this point. There is a question on confidentiality. I'm not sure, Brian, do you want to take that on?
Sure. There were some questions received regarding annual reports and whether they'd be subject to, treated as confidential or subject to FOIA requests, and specifically what exemptions of FOIA we think might apply to them. We think that, generally speaking, some of the information that comes through annual reports might be commercially sensitive information, and subject to an exemption from FOIA under Section 71G of the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. Having said that, in comments, I think it would be helpful if there are specific areas of what's required in annual reports that you think are particularly commercially sensitive. Identify those if you can, and we can try to set up a process then for having those redacted as a matter of course when we receive annual reports. It's the sort of thing where I think the industry's perspective is much better than the agency's perspective as to what is commercially sensitive. It's hard for us to put ourselves in your shoes as far as that goes. So additional feedback on which specific areas you think could potentially cause you competitive harm if disclosed would be very helpful. And it could just be kind of a high-level identification of here and why. And then we believe that we have an obligation at that point, if this information has been submitted to us as confidential, to defend that information from disclosure because it's been deemed commercially sensitive and thus subject to a FOIA exemption. So that's essentially how we'd be handling this. And we do think that there are at least valid legal grounds for not disclosing everything that comes into us if it does contain financial information that the furnishing party would like to protect.
Thank you. There is a question on how batches apply to community solar projects. I'm not sure, Kevin, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I guess the community solar projects could be submitted as a single project per batch. It's really up to you with the limitation in mind that a batch has to be at least 100 kilowatts in size unless it's the first batch for a small minority or woman-owned business, and a maximum of 2 megawatts in size. And so if you're doing large community solar projects that are right at the 2 megawatt size limit, then by definition with those restrictions, each community solar project will be its own batch. If you were doing smaller projects, say you were doing a number of 200 kilowatt projects, it would be entirely up to you if you wanted to batch up several 200 kilowatt projects into one batch, or if you wanted to submit a separate batch for each project. Keep in mind the proposals that were both proposed in the initial contract and any changes to that we might make with the assignment of contracts. If assignments were to be allowed on the batch level, then that would allow you to have some flexibility in how your contracts were assigned if you were to put your systems in separate batches.
Thank you. And related to community solar, there was another question related to unsubscribed RECs generated by a project. Will they remain the property of seller? So the short answer is yes, but just to clarify the question, and what it means is that tied to a community solar project will be a subscriber rate, meaning the percent of the kW capacity that is being subscribed at that point in time. So if it's for simplicity, a 100 kW system, 90% is subscribed, means that 90% 90 kW is the capacity for simplicity and illustrative to illustrate this point. And the rest of the 10 kW and RECs related to the 10 kW belongs to seller, and you can do whatever you want with that. There is a couple of questions dealing with process. Will this presentation and recording be provided online? The answer is yes. We will post that. There is a question related to the cover sheet. Why don't we just modify that in the contract itself? It's just the way that the contract is set up. with a master rec agreement as an exhibit. We don't make changes to the exhibit itself, but all changes to the master rec agreement are being made to the cover sheet. I hope this clarifies that. There's a question of how is a Schedule B included in a product order that is not yet energized at time of project application? And the answer is Schedule B is not introduced into the contract until a project is actually energized. So you'll not see that. Schedule A will be visible, but not Schedule B until Schedule B, until the project is energized. There's a question of what the trade date is. Trade date, again, is the date of the ICC approval. And it could be the same as the effective date of the contract. But for subsequent batches that are being approved, it need not necessarily be. The trade date is tied to a product order and reflects the date when a batch is being approved. There's a question regarding whether you can provide collateral in batches of system. Well, the collateral that must be provided is simply 5% of the value of the entire contract based on the proposed price and the proposed size at time of contract execution. That must be provided within 30 days of contract execution. So that is how it is handled, and the aggregate of the collateral requirement is what we call the performance assurance. There is a question of invoicing due date. How does the invoice due date and netting statement interact with cure periods for subscription levels? So the invoicing due date and netting statement for community solar projects in particular, that's the context, I think, of this question, will be done with a true-up mechanism that will be handled by the program administrator. So at prior to each invoice due date, we will provide a netting statement that indicates the maximum allowable that is authorized. And for community solar, there is an extra layer of adjustments afforded by the plan that adjusts on a quarterly basis during the first year of operations based on the subscription mix and the subscriber rate. We're taking that into consideration and account through the netting statement. If there is an increase in payments that is to be afforded for that particular quarter, we will make the necessary adjustments. If there is less, we will make the necessary adjustments downwards as well. But at some point after the first year of operations, it will be fixed, for which that will be the final payment that is due and will not be changed thereafter. I'm going to skip some of this. Can the standing order dates be different for different projects within a batch? The way that we are envisaging this is the standing order will be set up, initiated by you, the seller, and confirmed by the utility, the buyer. And once it is established, it authorizes payment, but also it authorizes automatic transfer of RECs from the system. So inevitably, the standing order will be different for different systems as they become energized and registered with GETS or MRETS. And we're trying to also have an end date for the standing order so that when the delivery term is over, the standing order will automatically stop the transfer, and there is nothing more that needs to be done by either buyer or seller. There is a question regarding prepayment of RECs for community solar over 5 years rather than a 15-year delivery term. It's an item that has been fixed in the plan as approved, so there's not much we can.
Ben, this is Brian. It extends from the law. It's not an election that we made within the plan.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
The one thing about that is that it's actually 4 years. It covers kind of, I suppose, portions of maybe a calendar year period, but it's 5 chunks over 4 years, 20% each. But my understanding of the rationale as to why it was introduced in the law is for budgeting concerns. So if you have projects coming online and you have 15 years of obligations associated with those projects, and you have annual budgets for the funds that you collect under the RPS, if you fill it all up at once effectively to maximize the amount that you're able to develop, then you have those obligations for the full 15 years. By having some form of prepayment, you'll have obligations that go off the books, and that allows you to keep more of a rolling development process where the market continues to grow. I think we would agree that it does pose some complexities that maybe weren't envisioned at the outset, but it's not something that we're in a position to adjust because it extends directly from the law.
Thank you. There was a question on there can only be one REC contract with each utility. Can you explain what that means? So what I will clarify here is that the REC contract that you will sign will be at a approved vendor utility level. Under the initial long-term plan, for which we have the adjustable block program, you will never be signing more than one contract with one utility. You could sign it with 3 utilities if your batches are assigned to all 3 utilities. But wherever your batches are assigned, once they're approved by the ICC, if it's assigned to only, you have some batches assigned to Ameren, Illinois, and some to ComEd, then you will sign 2 contracts, and only 2 contracts, one with Ameren, Illinois, and one with ComEd. But you will not sign 2 contracts with ComEd, for example. And there will be, for each approved batch, a product order that will be part of and subsume under that one REC contract. It's a master with many product orders. And with that product order, you could have multiple systems, and that will result in multiple Schedule A's and Schedule B. But that's sort of what I mean by there will be only one REC contract with each utility for the adjustable block program awards. So it doesn't cover any other REC contracts that you may have been a counterparty to under other competitive procurements with the utilities. Those are separate. I'm just referring in this limited scope to the adjustable block program. So I think there is one, it seems like there is one more clarifying question regarding when I say that all RECs produced from system over 15 years is the property of the buyer. Can I clarify that? And I think this question is related to a community solar project, with reference to community solar project. And to be very clear, for a community solar project, the portion that belongs to buyer during the 15-year term is only the percent or attributed to the percent that is being subscribed of the nameplate capacity. So again, if only 90% of the system is subscribed, then 90% of the RECs from the system throughout the 15-year term belongs to buyer. 10% is your property. There is a question on whether we can have a mechanism to provide for the collateral to be part of the first payment that is being withheld. The answer to that is, I'll say two things very quickly here. The first is we are taking that into consideration for systems that perhaps have been energized at time of ICC approval, meaning that the system has been built, you have able to get the system to even sign a standing order by the time the ICC approves the batch. We are considering for that limited scope at this time whether that can be practically handled. But for systems that have not yet been energized, we are thinking that we will need the collateral from you per the plan within 30 days of the ICC approval date. Again, the collateral requirement is to mitigate both development risk and delivery risk. If you, the payments are made only when your system is energized. But if your system is never energized, then we need something on hand to ensure that the system will be energized. Okay, I'm going to circle back to some of the questions. There are questions related to force majeure and whether there are revisions that we are contemplating on based on some of the specific comments that have been posted online as well. We're taking some of these things into considerations, but I am hesitant to commit to making changes to force majeure. I'm evaluating all of them very seriously, but there is a provision where force majeure would be considered on a case-by-case basis as well by the IPA if necessary, and that's part of the force majeure language that's there. So I'm not sure if we need to add additional carve-outs at this time, but I'm reviewing some of these comments to see if there are merits to putting them and in expanding the carve-outs that are provided in the force majeure requirements. There's a question on net metering. I'm not sure, Brian, if you would like to handle that one. Question is that they understand that there are some language that applies to rate-based utility assets, and they want to confirm that the IPA will not interpret this to apply to net metered projects.
That's correct. Yeah, that's never been our interpretation. As best we know, it's not the ICC's interpretation. It certainly wasn't the legislative intent when that provision was included in state law. So the use of net metering would not render a project ineligible for the adjustable block program or for meeting the RPS.
Okay, thank you. I think those, well, there are a couple more dealing with why New York law was chosen to govern the contract. And New York law is provided here to be consistent with other utility contracts. First of all, that has been signed related to REC procurements. We had looked at both New York law and Illinois law as viable options, and we thought that having New York law would also increase the level of participation with other developers or participants in this process. There is a question on process related to why are the names of the entities on the draft left undisclosed. That was quite deliberate so that we could focus on the comments rather than the commenters. Therefore, the names of the entities have been redacted as we post them. That's also the same documents, as I had said earlier, that are being used for evaluation on the merits of the comments by the review committee, which comprises of the IPA, the ICC staff, the procurement administrator, the program administrator, and the utilities. So we can focus on just looking at what the comments are about rather than who the comments are from. So I think that covers a lot of the items that I thought were there. Maybe I'll pause for a second and see whether Brian or Kevin, you have seen other things that have come on that you think have not been left answered that critical that for us to clarify on this call.
This is Brian. There's a lot that have come in through the questions both received ahead of time and also those through the group chat. They're all things that we'll take into account as we look back at the contract. So the fact that a question may not be addressed through this webinar doesn't mean that it won't be addressed in general. We know through the group chat, of course, there's been a lot of concern raised about having a second round, a second draft made available for comment. It's something that we can talk through internally. We certainly talked it through internally previously in posing the comment period or posing the webinar for this date and then a comment period to occur shortly thereafter. The goal was, of course, trying to move the program, trying to get the contract done in time for the program's posted launch date, but we'll continue to take that into account. There are a number of areas of the contract where there are changes underway. So the document that you saw and potentially the document that was explained today will not look like the document that you ultimately see eventually. So it's important to keep that in mind. We're taking those concerns into account. And in some instances, we're working on language to address them. We can continue to think through ways to communicate answers to questions that may not have been adequately addressed through this webinar. So we'll take that into account. We'll keep that in mind. Beyond that, for comments due on Monday, I think I pointed out a few areas earlier where we think it would be helpful to focus on, but certainly anything else, feel free to go ahead and provide us with substitute language. It's always good to understand the rationale behind those comments, because that's something that ultimately informs whether we think the comment is something worth adopting. So try to keep that in mind as you propose language. Don't just propose a red line, but don't just propose the flagging of an issue. Try to marry the solution of a problem with proposed language. That always makes for the most effective comments. Kevin, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add specifically or anything else that you wanted to address.
There's just one question that came in kind of late that I wanted to address from a mechanical standpoint, which is the 5% collateral. How does the 5% collateral work over time? So in the current draft, the 5% collateral is not reevaluated until the 5% exceeds the remaining contract value. That's consistent with the plan language. And it's also evaluated at the time that there is a collateral drawdown. The current plan doesn't have a mechanism in place where the 5% is adjusted on some regular basis throughout the 15-year term. If you feel like you would like to comment on that process, then please do keep in mind that it is evaluated over the entire portfolio of an approved vendor and what the impacts of that will be. And also just the, obviously you're not going to be able to reevaluate the 5% collateral on a weekly or monthly basis over the entire 15-year term, just from an administrative standpoint. So I'll address that. Again, the email address for your comments is comments@illinoisibp or abp.com. So that's the address to send your comments to. Same address as we've used before. Website site is again www.illinoisabp.com for looking at the draft that we had already published and comments that have already come in.
Thank you. So with that, I think we have covered, I know there are several other questions that have come in that we may not be able to get through, but submit your comments to us, things that you have heard. I'm not seeing any more clarifying comments or questions asking for clarifications, but more comments at this point. I ask that you put them in writing, send it to us so that we have them and we can review them and take them into consideration. So with that, the process is laid out, does not envisage or contemplate a second draft of the contract to be posted at this time, but does ask you to have your comments sent to us if you have additional comments based on the contract as drafted, based on today's webcast that perhaps has clarified some of the provisions in the contract as well as the rationale of why we are drafting, I have drafted the provisions as they stand, as well as the comments from other commenters posted online. Taking all those into consideration, if you have further comments, we ask that you send it to us. They're on this slide 6, and certainly after this call, we will post the webinar presentation as well as recording online for you to review as well. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming. We will end today's call, and certainly with comments or questions subsequent to this point, you can send them to the email address comments@illinoisabp.com. Thanks everyone. You may now disconnect.